Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales Off History's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, who hasn't been to New York City, the borough of Manhattan specifically, and had the chance to experience the road system we all fondly refer to as the grid? Now, driving in the city is not for the meek and mild. It's not for everybody. I know that. It can feel like driving a bumper car, except you're not supposed to be doing any bumping. But the grid is what makes it possible for us to get around Manhattan and know where you are. It's a very orderly progression of streets and avenues laid out so it all makes sense. Ironically, though, once the grid gets infected by too many drivers and gridlock takes over, well, it makes travel less enjoyable. Well, love it or hate it, it is an incredible traffic pattern, and here today to tell us the fascinating background of how it all came to be is Eric Hodgetts. Now, Eric's a professional tour guide for many aspects of New York City. He provides webinars for the New York Adventure Club, a great thing that I would recommend you get involved with. And the particular webinar that he's going to be drawing from today is the Manhattan Grid webinar. Facts and figures will come from that. Now, you can track down Eric and all of his knowledgeable webinar information at his Linktree site. He's going to be along in just a moment. Eighth Avenue and 24th Street, West 57th Street, Avenue A. Yes, these are all New York City addresses, very familiar in many cases. These are all locations made searchable thanks to the infamous New York City grid. Now, on the one hand, the grid is very simple and straightforward. The streets start at number 1, they go up to 155, and they move from lower Manhattan up to the northern stretches, one after the other. The avenues, well, they're numbered 1 through 12, and they run up and down Manhattan Island, crossing each of the 155 streets. Sounds simple, right? Well, not really. We do have avenues that don't have numbers, like Avenue A, B, C, and D, and then there's also Madison, Lexington, and Park thrown in for good measure. And of course, then there's Broadway, which simply meanders across the grid in no particularly logical way, breaking up an otherwise very orderly arrangement. Well, that was a historic New York City road that nobody, frankly, wanted to abandon. Well, the grid wasn't always there, and that's, in fact, part of the interesting backstory. Nobody seems to know who actually came up with the idea to put in a grid. We have an expert on the grid with us today, a man who does webinars on a number of aspects of New York City, and the info you're going to hear from Eric Hodgetts is from the webinar he does for the New York Adventure Club. Eric, I love to drive in downtown New York City on the grid. I think it's fun. I don't mind, dodging in and out with the cabs and keeping my place in line. I don't mind it. Some people dread it. Tell me, though, what it would have been like back in 1810. Let's dial back the clock, back before there was a grid, back before there were cars. How did you get around Manhattan Island?
Well, as you mentioned, it wouldn't have been driving because this was the time of horse and carriage. And even the new grid wasn't designed for automobiles. But what had happened is, since its founding by the Dutch back in the 1600s, Manhattan had kind of grown organically over time without any real plan. And the Dutch had their New Amsterdam settlement on the very southernmost tip of the island, stretching up to what is Wall Street today. And then the British expanded that, getting up to about what we call Houston Street on the east side, which actually they used to call North Street because it was as far north as the city had come. But really, the zone just up against where the grid starts was a series of farms originally. And when they saw that people would want to move up into that area, they subdivided their own land any way that they wanted to. So this created a series of separate little local orientations. If you go through the Meatpacking District, the West Village, Soho, over to the Lower East Side, you can definitely see the impact of that. But we have to remember also that cities like London and Paris that people had grown up with would also have grown in that organic way.
So now, as I said, I like to drive the grid. If I'm really brave, I will go south of Houston Street and try and navigate some of those smaller original streets or semi-original streets from the old days. And it's like you're in a different country when you go down there today.
You are, for sure. The streets are much narrower. And, one of the things they said they wanted to address was there were short, narrow, and crooked streets, all with little alleys and courts. And they really efficiency of navigation was definitely one of the driving factors.
And one of the things that people don't stop to think about, and I don't want to dwell on this by any stretch of the imagination, but when you got around by horse and buggy, you had to deal with horse manure and quite a bit of it. And it was the number one solid waste management problem for the city of New York up until the 1890s before cars started coming in. Where did they put all that stuff?
That is absolutely true. It was a large part of the solid waste management problem, but not by far the only one. There was so much trash in New York. There were things like piles of oyster shells down on the waterfront, food trash everywhere, construction debris. In fact, there was so much food trash that in poor neighborhoods, people would routinely buy a piglet and let it loose in the streets to eat food trash for a year or two and then collect it as a valuable source of meat. The flip side to the horse manure question is that it was not just a trash problem, but it was big business because horse manure was valuable for fertilizer. And so the city used to auction off the right to collect horse manure from the streets to the highest bidder, who would then sell it to farmers upstate and out on Long Island. If you really wanted fancy manure, you would buy from someone who had a private stables.
So now, 1811, somebody comes up with the concept that we've got to put some order into this. And I'm not sure from my reading of the history, and this is why I couldn't wait to talk to you about it, I can't put my finger on anybody who specifically said, I think we ought to do a grid, except maybe you go back to this guy, Casimir Girk. I don't want to say any more. Straighten us out. What's the history of the grid? Who came up with it?
We really have to understand why, in the first place, the city wanted to create a grid, right? And part of this drives out of what was known as the common land. Basically, most of what would be Midtown into the Upper East and West Sides today. And over the intervening decades, the city had sold off the most desirable land, which was along the waterfront, because you needed boats to transport anything of size, right? So they were like the early highways. But the undesirable, rocky, irregular ground in the middle of the island still belonged to the city. And it stretched from about 23rd Street to 90th Street today, right up the middle of the island. After the American Revolution, we had a lot of debt. And so they thought, we should sell off the common lands. We're at a point where people would buy that, even though we thought it was undesirable. And you are right to focus on Casimir Girk, who was the surveyor that they brought in to lay this out. But the origin of the grid itself is a bit shrouded in mystery. What we do know is Girk chopped the common lands up into 5-acre lots, right, in a size very similar to a New York City block today, long east-west, narrow uptown. Basically was trying to make real estate saleable. They knew you would have to get around between them. So Girk's original plan has 3 big uptown roads. It's called the East Road, the Middle Road, and the West Road. And these, in fact, correspond fairly closely to where Park Avenue, Fifth Avenue, and 6th Avenue are today. But it said he was instructed to use a 5-acre lot, but no individual is attached to that.
Putting this into effect, where you had a city that had grown up with, as you put it, sort of paths and horse trails and whatnot, and having to come in where sometimes farms existed, sometimes houses existed, and move all this out of the way. I mean, this was a major project to build this grid. What was that like?
It was a major project, and it would end up really taking most of the 1800s to lay out, create the grid, and fill it in. The pattern of land ownership in Manhattan was very different beforehand. There was kind of one angled path up the island, and most of what was here was farms. And the way that you would organize your farm was in a long strip of land. You wanted a frontage on the road, because that's how you get back and forth on the island by horse. But you also wanted the back to be on the river so that you could bring a boat up and transport your crops. So just imagine that row of long, narrow strips, and the grid gets overlaid on that. And interestingly, the commission brings in a very talented surveyor named John Randall Jr. to lay out the grid. And he's actually got to do 2 surveys. First, he has to go and document everything that's there accurately. So he spends time going all the way up the island. And then when the plan is done, he has to come back and lay out markers for all the blocks on top of it. And that is the more contentious work, because the people who had this farmland thought that what was going to happen was a terrible idea that would destroy their property. So there are stories of people setting their dogs on the survey team, throwing cabbages at them, but they made their way up the island, setting physical markers at the four corners of every intersection, and they did eventually complete the job. So this meant that the city did have to buy up by eminent domain all of the paths of the streets, but it chopped up your property so much that you might want to buy some adjacent parcels just to put a reasonable parcel back in place. And there's many places in the city where you can see little traces of that in boundary lines. If you go to the Chrysler building, the base of the Chrysler building is not a rectangle. The east side takes this weird angled sort of northeast path, and that's because the edge of that lot used to front on the Boston Post Road. So people are making these thousands and thousands of real estate transactions to try to put things together. The other thing that happened was it's entirely possible that your house or some building on your land might end up right in the path of the road. And people said, I don't want to lose the value of my house. So technology was developed to move houses on rails. There was a big business that they would jack up your house and slowly move it off out of the path of the road. And then there's one more factor, this being New York City, which is that in the decades following the establishment of the plan, we get a notoriously corrupt cabal of politicians who become our city government, and these become known as Tammany Hall. And folks who've heard of Tammany Hall probably know William Boss Tweed, who was the biggest embezzler of them all. They say that he embezzled probably more than $5 billion in today's money, although unfortunately he eventually was imprisoned for it and died there. But what Tammany Hall would do is they look at the grid plan and say, okay, so we got to open up 6th Avenue between 24th and 32nd Streets. Nobody knows we're going to do this. So we will leak this information to our business buddies. Tell them, go buy up all the real estate around, just buy it. Whatever the people want for it, you buy it because it is going to triple in value. Then they would announce the opening of the street and all of their buddies would cash in on the opportunity.
There are rules to this grid, and it's the only way that I originally found for navigating the city. And let's talk about some of these. Now, the blocks going from like 53rd Street to 73rd Street, that's 20 blocks, that's a mile. Is that accurate?
That's more or less. I use that rule of thumb myself all the time. I'm not aware that the traffic pattern was part of the grid plan itself, because remember, no automobiles, right? So the avenues are wide enough for multiple lanes of horse and carriage traffic that can potentially go both ways. So I think our traffic pattern is a later development, but you're right to look at this interesting structure of the blocks and the avenues. And as I mentioned, the size and configuration of them really just seems to come from the handy 5-acre lot of Casimir Girk's plan. One of the problems with the old streets in Manhattan is they were quite narrow, right? To have a 30-foot wide street building to building was, considered pretty significant. And there was a thought at the time that better ventilation would help to control things like disease. So they said, well, we got to have long, straight, wide streets. And so the commission was given the task that all the streets had to be at least 60 feet wide, at least twice as wide as the old streets. And that is the standard width of a cross street in Manhattan. For the avenues, they went even a little wider to 100 feet. And they did understand that you were going to need to have crosstown traffic at periodic spots that could get through more efficiently. So those wider cross streets are also 100 feet. And you might think, well, these folks are so super rational about this. Certainly, they are going to lay out those cross streets on some kind of a rational plan, like, I don't know, every 10 blocks, right? 10th Street, 20th Street, 30th Street. However, existing development and the configuration of the island prevented them from hitting those even numbers. And so they ended up with something that's close, but not quite, right? 14th Street, 23rd Street, 34th Street. They're so close to getting it on every one. There actually is a stretch further uptown, 86, 96, 106, 116, where they hit the 10-block spacing, but of course they couldn't hit those round numbers.
If I have this right, didn't DeWitt Clinton, as mayor, appoint this commission?
He most certainly did not. And what happened was the city council in New York had struggled for years to try to put a process in place, but there were just too many competing local interests, right? People who owned real estate in the city. So what they ended up doing in 1807 was to kick it up to the state government in Albany. And technically, it is the state government that appoints the commission. And the commission are three people. One, they needed a surveyor, so they hired a guy named Simeon DeWitt. Simeon DeWitt had also been the chief surveyor for Washington's army during the Revolution and had gone on to be the surveyor for New York State. So we know you needed him. The real driver of the commission is a guy by the name of Gouverneur Morris, who is perhaps one of the least known of the founding fathers, who should be better known. He was the guy who, in fact, penned himself the entire preamble of the Constitution, if you know, "We the People." He brings a third guy in named John Rutherford. And if you know Rutherford or East Rutherford out in New Jersey, he was a wealthy landowner. But what I find interesting about this commission, right, it's like they wanted to pick people from outside New York City who didn't have vested interests in the city. But, as an architect myself, I'm like, where are the architects? Where are the urban planners? These are a politician, a wealthy guy, and a surveyor. And that tells you something about the very utilitarian nature of their job, right? They were not trying to make some fancy Parisian style thing. They even explicitly rejected the plans that Pierre L'Enfant had done down in Washington, D.C., where he made angled boulevards and oval intersections. And they make this very utilitarian plan. And when people ask them, well, why did you make this rectangular grid? They said, well, what we build in the city is mostly residential houses, and residential houses tend to be rectangles. So if you want to pack them together, the grid is the most efficient way to do that.
Fascinating. Now, as you said, it was most of the 1800s that they were putting this into place, and through most of the 1800s, we didn't have cars. I'm wondering, when did the numbers of the streets get put in? Was that right away?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The numbers are part and parcel of the original plan. And I mentioned that the old North Street, what is now East Houston, on the east side was as far north as the city had come. So that is where they were able to put the first cross street in. And if you go just above Houston Street, you will see First Street and the streets, that sort of run on up from there. The issue that they ran into downtown, of course, is that, First Avenue was a great idea, but further down in the island, in what is today's East Village, it actually extends further in the other direction. So rather than go east with maybe some negative numbers or something like that, they decided to use letters. And so if you know Avenue A, B, C, and D, that's how they addressed that area, which of course gave it its later nickname, Alphabet City.
Wow, great trivia. Absolutely great trivia. Why is there no Fourth Avenue?
Oh, but there is a Fourth Avenue. However, today, the only stretch that bears that name is also down in the East Village. But most people don't recognize that Fourth Avenue still exists between Third Avenue and Fifth Avenue. It just has a different name today. And in fact, Fourth Avenue is where the train line used to run down into the city. And the original depot for that was down around where Union Square is today, down around 14th Street. And as the city kept expanding, they kept moving the train terminal further north. It moved from there up to about 26th Street, adjacent to what is Madison Square Park today. And that's got some interesting history itself. And then eventually it get pushed as far as 42nd Street, where it became today's Grand Central Terminal. But Fourth Avenue accommodated that train line. And so it was a little bit wider, but there were some geographic features on the island that we don't see as much today. And one of them was a big rise. The Dutch had called this the Inklenburg, but we know it better today as Murray Hill. And back in the day, steam trains had limited power and they were not able to get up the slope of Murray Hill. So what they did was they cut a flat path. There was an open cut. It was called the Murray Hill Rock Cut, where the train would run and continue up there. But as the city developed into that area, people said, it's not so nice to have the noise and the smoke of a steam train. You should really cover over that open cut. And they did. They turned it into a tunnel, but they had some land on top of the tunnel. They said, well, we could just landscape it. We'll put some plants and we'll put some benches. And people said, oh, it kind of looks like a park. Lo and behold, they decided to rebrand that stretch of Fourth Avenue as Park Avenue. And this is why Park Avenue addresses start down at 32nd Street. And eventually it would take its fancy name all the way uptown. Only later was the rest of Fourth Avenue rebranded. And we know that today as Park Avenue South. But if you walk up Park Avenue South today and you have a sharp eye at places like 23rd Street and 27th Street, you might see some signs on buildings that still reference Fourth Avenue.
here we are talking about the grid, and what is the one thing that drivers get crazy about is grid lock. Did we do the right thing putting this grid in for cars?
That's a valid question. All we can say is that the commissioners had absolutely no concept of the future technology that would develop. And it's not just automobiles. They had no idea that we would have trains. I mean, steam trains were just getting to be a thing, but the fact that we would dig an underground subway system, which would have completely its own logic in some ways and how it got around the city, the fact that we would develop air travel and that the 3 regional airports would become big factors. But, the grid was effectively retrofitted for car travel. And, it served a relatively good purpose. But technology like traffic lights, like traffic control systems, were all far in the future.
Well, also further off in the future was another major project for New York, this one at the state level. You may have heard of it. It's called the Erie Canal. DeWitt Clinton was also involved with that project. He went on from being the mayor of New York City to the governor of New York State, and he drew on his experience with the grid project, formed a commission to pursue the canal project, and guess what? It had 2 of the 3 same members who were also involved in the grid commission. That's going to wrap up this episode of Amazing Tales Off History's Beaten Path. There is so much other interesting trivia about the New York City street grid, like the secret behind Stuyvesant Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues in Lower Manhattan. Now, I'm not going to give that one away, but to learn about it, you really should look up Eric Hodgetts. He's with the New York Adventure Club. He does webinar informational programs, and he does them on a number of interesting New York City items. I joined up with the New York Adventure Club just to see what they have, and it's fascinating. You ought to do the same. I want to thank Eric for being here today and sharing all of his knowledge. Amazing Tales Off History's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.